Hello and welcome. My name is Allison Van, and I'm the Executive Director of CRESS, the Center for Research in Empirical Social Sciences, which in the new year, just to confuse you, will be officially renamed SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. This series, Relevant Research, is hosted by the Sherman Center for Digital Scholarship and CRESS-SPARC with generous funding from SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Dr. Brian Southwell is joining us from North Carolina, where he is a very busy man. He is Senior Director of the Science in the Public Sphere program in the Center for Communication Science at RTI International, teaches at both Duke University and the University of North Carolina, and actively works to increase public understanding of science in multiple ways, including with an excellent radio show and podcast called The Measure of Everyday Life, which I encourage you to check out on your podcast catcher of choice. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Allison, for organizing this. I think it's wonderful that your university has a series like this. It's something that I deeply appreciate. And so, and thank you all again for taking the time for being here. And I want to thank Cheryl in advance. We found that sharing slides there locally, I think, is going to be a little bit crisper and cleaner for the recording. So we're going to do it that way. So I really appreciate conversations like this. They're ones that I think it's easy to kind of push off to the side as people are busy, engaged with their research. But over time, I've found that it's an important set of considerations to keep in mind, and that there are numerous benefits, not only in terms of public understanding and public engagement, but even in terms of one's own career that can really come from thinking about some of the ideas that I want to raise today. And so I think this will be hopefully time well worth spending. I also want to note that we've got 90 minutes together now, and then a chance to check in again later in the future. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the end of our conversation. I'm happy to follow up and have additional conversations beyond this, because I know we're just going to be touching the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of these ideas. So Cheryl, if you don't mind, if you want to go ahead and move there to slides. I do have some remarks, ideas I want to raise. There are going to be a few instances when I'm going to want to hear from you all, even during this session, and a chance for you to talk to each other a little bit as well. Maybe many of you know each other, but you might not know everybody on the screen, and so there'll be a chance in a breakout room to talk to at least a few other people too for a minute. But Cheryl, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share the slides, the opening slide. Great. Okay. And if you want to go ahead actually and move to the next slide, thank you so much. So there are really three main tasks that I'd like to accomplish today. And then there's a last item that I'm going to ask you to think about.
Leah here from LeiaPersci.com. And in this video, we'll do a quick overview.
And okay, great. Thanks. If we want to mute if needed. Okay. So there are multiple audiences you might think about in terms of mobilizing knowledge about your work and in translating your work for other audiences. I want to spend some time thinking about audiences outside of universities, outside of academic settings, as a first consideration. And I want to do that from a particular psychological perspective, to really put ourselves in the perspective of audiences. And it's something I think needs to happen more than it does. I also want us to spend some time thinking about intermediaries, thinking about instances in which you might be able to partner with and respond to and talk with media professionals, journalists, and others, about your work as a way of putting a spotlight on it and as a way of contributing to larger dialogue and larger discussion. That's not something people are always completely comfortable with, and I want to offer some insights and perspectives. I've had the good fortune of both doing a fair amount of that with regards to my own academic research, but also, in the last decade or so, playing a bit of a role in that regard, on the other side of the microphone. And so I want to offer some ideas, there too. And then last, I want to spend some time thinking about how it is that you might not only advocate for the ideas that stem from your own research, but that you also might be part of efforts to counter misperceptions that are out there. We increasingly are in a public information environment that is, filled with misinformation. People have worried about that in lots of different ways. And there's an interesting question what role academic researchers might play in countering those misperceptions. So I want to spend at least a few minutes talking about that. That's an area of inquiry that I've been involved with myself as a researcher. And I've got some ideas that are a little bit different than is sometimes what's offered in terms of remedy from different pundits. And then last, we'll talk about how we might come together next time and put a little bit more of a direct spotlight on exactly what each of you is working on. So Cheryl, next slide would be great. Okay, so, and actually go ahead to the next slide as well. So in thinking about audiences outside of universities, I want us to just spend some time remembering, the socialization that we've all gone through to get to this point. And it's a socialization that many audience members, many people outside of university settings haven't gone through. And that can leave us at a bit of a disconnect in terms of being able to relate to or really fully understand what it is that people want to know about our work. And at the same time, I think it's very important to recognize that just because people, walking on the street, when you're able to do that in a socially distanced way, you might not overhear them, talking about your latest, peer-reviewed research article. It doesn't mean they're not going to potentially at some point be capable of being interested or being curious, in the topic. So I think it's crucial for us to recognize that what people tend to pay attention to isn't necessarily, fully representative of everything that they might be curious about. And yet at the same time, it is really important to pay attention to what people's information diet has been prior to this moment in time. So one way of thinking about this idea that audiences aren't blank slates that you're somehow going to be able to just address, as though and to offer up, whatever you'd like to say about your research, is to keep in mind this notion of mental models. And this is something that if you had a chance to see the advanced video that Allison has shared, you'll have heard some of these ideas, but I want to just briefly in a couple of minutes refresh or introduce, for those of you that haven't had a chance to hear about that, this concept, this notion, because I think that existing mental models matter. They are really the architecture for and they offer the possibility for future communication in really important ways. So we have to pay attention to what's in people's head, and I think it also makes sense for us to pay attention to the information environment that people have been swimming in, prior to encountering some press release about our research. If you want to move to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, so this is an example that I'd raised before, but I think it's one that helps to really explain this notion of a mental model. If I were to mention the notion of a house, to you, something would come to mind, right? For each of you, maybe it's your own house, maybe it's an archetypal sense of a house, maybe it is. There are all sorts of things that might come up, and part of my point is that what would come to mind for people is going to vary considerably. For some people, it may be just a simple, iconic, sense of what a house is, and nothing more complicated than that. For other people, though, and you want to move to the next slide, we might actually expect there to be something much more complex, something that actually has to do with design or even building materials, or that has something to do with the topography or the geography where the house is located, or something that has to do with the occupants of the house. All this is to say that people can have varying mental models that can change over time, but that actually really set the stage for the communication that we might have about houses. And so this example, I think, can translate to all sorts of phenomena. It's important for us to keep in mind, when we make the statement that people are not necessarily interested in social science research, it's a really important for us to recognize that what that phrase brings to mind is going to vary considerably for all sorts of people. And I think that a mistake that we make sometimes is that we think that because we haven't necessarily seen widespread engagement, in the nuanced research that we're doing, that it reflects people having judged, what we're doing is just simply not interesting. When in fact, it might be that they don't necessarily have the precursor, vocabulary or context, to understand why what you're doing is so interesting. And so I think part of the effort that we need to make sometimes is to actually be willing to, articulate basic ideas, be willing to kind of give people some ideas about, core concepts that are related to, the later research that we're going to talk about. And that's a role that I think academic researchers can help play. And we can help inform, the way that some of these ideas are talked about, in news coverage, the way that, people might understand these ideas outside of university settings. Now, the mental models notion itself actually has some academic import. And this is something that I think some of you might be familiar with. But I want to just point out a couple of examples where this has turned out to be useful in my own research. My work, much of my work has to do with public understanding of science and health. And we've done that work, particularly in recent years. An interesting dimension of our work has been with regards to emerging infectious diseases. And as you can imagine, the last year has been really busy for us. But even prior to that, my colleagues and I at RTI International were doing a fair amount of work on, for example, Ebola and also on Zika virus. And the mental models notion popped up as actually being quite interesting and useful for some of that work. So if you want to move to the next slide, I can talk about one example of this. In the midst of the Zika virus outbreak that we saw a few years ago, we were partnering with the Ministry of Health in Guatemala. And we did some work to talk with people in different parts of the country about their understanding of Zika virus. And as it turns out, people were quite familiar with, or had a sense anyway, or reported a sense of Zika virus, but they viewed this as yet another mosquito-borne disease, yet another disease transmitted by mosquitoes. This is an area in a country where people are very familiar with dengue and chikungunya, for example. And Zika virus, for many people, was yet another in that sequence. And so it was interesting to know that there is actually a fair amount of awareness of Zika virus. And yet, what was interesting about it was this conceptualization as yet another in a string of mosquito-borne diseases missed something really important. So by understanding Zika virus to be a mosquito-borne disease, what people were overlooking was a really important twist in terms of the transmission of Zika virus, which, as many of you, will know, also turns out to be sexually transmitted from person to person. And that's different. That's different than what we see with a lot of these mosquito-borne diseases. And so in this particular case, trying to get a sense for how people understood the mechanisms for transmission, how they understood the disease itself, pointed out a really important omission in many people's mental models that could be addressed with a subsequent public campaign. And so that was something we only learned about in an open-ended way, kind of asking people how they understood the disease. And we would have missed that if we just had talked about, their attitude toward prevention, for example. And so that was really important. And people were surprised by and somewhat alarmed by the fact that it could be sexually transmitted, especially amongst asymptomatic people. So if you want to move to the next slide, I'll talk about an example of this as it relates to our current COVID-19 pandemic. This is a new paper that is out in Health Communication presently. And in this particular situation, we wanted to understand how it is that existing mental models of infectious disease might be affecting public understanding of COVID-19. And in this particular case, what we found was that actually pre-existing perceptions of vaccination, were really important in terms of driving, the likelihood and willingness for hypothetical vaccination. Now, this was back in spring 2020, before we had all of the news we have now about vaccines. But early on, people were thinking about COVID-19 as they were thinking about flu. And this is important because obviously flu and COVID-19 are very different, and vaccination for them is also very different. But we found correspondence between tendency towards flu vaccination and tendency towards COVID-19 vaccination. Again, another opportunity for public communication to potentially address this. Okay, well, that's fine as an academic concept to use with something like public understanding of disease. How might we apply that though towards thinking about social science research, thinking about the work that many of you do? What is it that people think about that work, and how might that actually precondition their receptiveness to future knowledge mobilization efforts? This is something that I think is crucial for us to keep in mind, but that we sometimes overlook. So here, if you want to move to the next slide, I'd like us in just a moment to move into some breakout groups to talk with just a few other people for about 5 minutes about this question. And if you move on, if you can get to the second and third question, that's great. But even if you just get to the first one, and this is a question I think is best thought about. Here in the U.S., we've had our Thanksgiving break recently. Historically, that's an opportunity where you get together with relatives and perhaps not talk about the work that you do at the university and talk about all kinds of other things. And so the interesting question is, even to your relatives or to others, what do people think about what it is you do? And that's something that I think is really important to keep in mind. So let's talk for just a minute, and I want you to try to elevate out of your discussion at least one idea that you might bring back to the group here. What are some of the stereotypes that you think people might hold? What do you think is the understanding people have of social science research? If I were to have a news headline that had that, what would people think? What would come to mind? We're talking about people not affiliated with universities or colleges. What is it that people tend to think about when you use that phrase? And let's just talk about it, brainstorm some ideas, and then we'll come back in about 5 minutes if that works. Okay, we'll give people just a minute to come back here. While we are doing that, sure, actually, we can go ahead and stay on the slide for just a minute. Yep. So as we're waiting for folks to come back, actually, let's take advantage of the chat function here. If you could put into the chat, just one quick bullet point idea. This isn't you talking. This is something you heard from your group, something that was striking or surprising or disappointing or encouraging about what you think people outside of academic settings think about, not only with regard to social science research, but obviously research. We've got a lot of different people on the call here today. Just a couple of examples there. So as we're coming back in, we're going to just put in the chat just one thing you heard about social science research or about research that you think characterizes how the wider public thinks about the work that we do. Great. I see some chat, some comments already. Great. Excellent. So we've got perception here, both about social science as perhaps being softer than other sciences. We've got ideas that what we're doing is really a matter of vague terminology, that it's easy, not deserving of funding, disconnected from what's happening, a pretty depressing view here we got here on a Friday morning. And we don't know what it is. We need specific examples. There's a lot of work we have to do here then, right? I mean, this is, but I think this is something journalists are just looking for a good story. What's the application? Okay. So, all right, we've got some more come in. We'll give people just a minute here to put that in. We've got preconceived notions, and that's something we want to address. And also ideas about the people that we work with and the partners and the populations that we're studying. Okay. All right. Great. Too theoretical or abstract. Excellent. There's real concerns here about the seriousness of particular areas, and even in terms of perhaps about generalizability or about the sense of the sample size and misunderstanding about that and important caveats, right? You can think about some of this also in terms of some of the immediate judgment or misunderstanding of recent announcements about new vaccines. There's been a really interesting array of perspectives on that, and this is good, and this is a good list here to kind of get us started. So why start there? I don't want to start there just to depress everybody, but I think it's worthwhile to start there because this might be part of what you have in mind in taking the next steps to translate your work for people. It's partly to address some of these misconceptions, but also partly to address the conceptions that aren't misconceptions, just the ideas and beliefs that people have. And we have to respect that there might be, a political philosophy underpinning where they're coming from, and to what extent might we be able to meet them, at least in terms of their values in a place of where there is some shared interest and value. Can we point that out? We know from work on trust and science, and this is a work that I do a lot of work in, it's not just a matter of intellectual credibility that builds trust. It's also a matter of perception of shared interest. And so to what extent can you actually identify those instances where there are shared values, there are shared interests between what you're doing and what the local small business owner is thinking. And so that's something I want you to keep in mind here. But now I want to shift slightly to think about how you might get the word out about your work, because you can put, this is something that you say to yourself, well, I published in this, journal, and so the world's seeing, my work. Unfortunately, particularly now, it might only be folks that have subscription to that journal that are seeing that work. It's certainly not the case that millions of people usually are seeing peer-reviewed journal articles. There's extra work that sometimes needs to be done. Peer-reviewed journal articles are crucial. And I don't want to misinterpret anything I'm saying as undermining those as a very basic forum and a fundamental aspect of the work that we do. We're not going to, it would be a bad idea if we move to everybody just writing their own blog posts, or everybody just solely working with journalists in that way. However, I want to spend some time talking about news media, talking about journalism, and talking about the intersection with your work. Because I think there are opportunities for everybody on the call right now to have productive and interesting conversations with journalists about what they do. And yet, many of you might have been burned in the past, or might have felt like that didn't go particularly well, or that you've been overlooked. And I want to spend some time really thinking about that. So if we're going to move to the next slide here, we can go ahead and move to the next slide, and then actually the next slide beyond that, if you don't mind. So I want to spend a minute just talking about an interesting meta level discussion that I had a couple of years ago. So one of the roles that I play, as Allison noted, is that I host a public radio show here in the US, in addition to being a full-time academic researcher. On that show, we actually had, we almost always are interviewing and talking with academic researchers about their work. But we sometimes have a chance to talk with celebrities, talk with journalists, talk with others. We've talked with Norman Lear and with Soledad O'Brien and other people about topics that relate to everyday life, and particularly social science. Well, we had an opportunity to talk with Marco Werman a couple of years ago. Marco Werman hosts Public Radio International's The World. And so what I wanted to do is to talk to Marco about what he thought about academic research, how it was useful to him. And I've got the link here, and I can actually put the live link in the chat, which, hold on one second, and I will do that. We're not going to take time to listen to that episode, but you can go and download it at this link. But I'm going to give you a preview of a couple of the ideas there. So for your later interest, I put that into the chat. If we move to the next slide, though, I'll tell you a little bit about what Marco had to say about academic research. So here's Marco on his visit to North Carolina. And we had a wide-ranging conversation, but at one point, I appreciated this. He was willing to be pretty candid. And he said, you'll see the quote on the screen, that his sense is that academia has not done a good job in terms of boiling down explanations to a usable level. What he wanted is for folks to really, as he says, bullet point your research, give me the abstract, that's all I need. And I point this out because this may not be surprising to you. It is an opportunity, that you have to address, journalists, but it also might be disheartening, to some of you. And so I want to talk about a little bit of a counterpoint to that here in just a second. But just to note that it is worthwhile going into any media interview, to have, I often will have with me a quick list or a couple of bullet points on the screen of 2 or 3 things that I think I'd like to say in half a sentence or a sentence or less. And if I get to those and I can answer the questions and kind of keep those in mind, I mean, I often will have a couple minutes at most, and especially TV interviews I do. Sometimes it'll be 30 seconds or a minute, here or even that, not even that much, time. And so you'll be all prepared. You've got all these ideas about the nuances and caveats of your research, and then the journalist will ask you some questions sort of out of nowhere, and you'll lose your train of thought, and it'll get lost in these details, and it won't go particularly well. If you've got just those couple quick headline things that you want to mention, that can be useful. And as it turns out, that's what people like Marco want. So there's that opportunity. But I also want to talk about sort of an expanded sense of ways in which you might articulate some of your ideas. And the ways that you might think about the kind of middle ground between your peer-reviewed research and public engagement. There's sort of the extreme of a high-profile 15-second TV soundbite, and then there's a lot of things that happen sort of in between that are possibilities that I'd like to encourage you to think about. Now, if you want to move to the next slide, Cheryl, that'd be great. I want you to think about these as all opportunities for translating your work. Now, increasingly in grant applications, and I believe that that's true in Canada, now there is a formal obligation to do some of this. So I want to provide some creative ways and thoughts about how you might engage with publics about your work. But I also just want to point out this kind of work can reach a variety of audiences, and sometimes you might actually reach other researchers through this kind of work more directly, believe it or not, than through your peer-reviewed research. I was just mentioning before we got on the call this morning how that's certainly been the case for me with regards to misinformation. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of that here in just a minute. Instances in which the blog posts and the media interviews are what attract people to the work that then hopefully they're eventually reading, but it's not necessarily the initial encounter with a peer-reviewed journal article is what people are initially finding in all instances. So you might think about all these different roles that people can play. You could view yourself as being a legitimate source for news stories. That's something that McMaster might view you as being on a short list to talk about a particular topic. And if you're not on that short list, you should think about ways to let folks like Allison and others know about your interest in talking about those topics. You yourself can put ideas together in on a blog, on a not just on McMaster's site, but on other sites. But I also want you to think about more creative ways. There are opportunities for you to engage with even popular media content.
or to inform, what's out there. I had the opportunity. I worked for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention a number of years ago, and one of the stranger things that I had a chance to work on were some TV scripts. There were instances in which we were consulted and partnered with. There's an old show in the 1990s. Actually, it was remade, and even that is now old, called Beverly Hills 90210. And there were an instance where I was able to work on a script as it related to a cancer diagnosis for one of the characters. And being in that arena, it's an opportunity. You're not going to win every battle, but you might actually help to shape how particular ideas are talked about. That's something that there's room for academic consultation as well. And then also there's an opportunity for you within your own professional and social networks to counter misinformation, that might be out there, misperceptions. And that's an important role. And that might be related to those first ones, but that's something that you might think about. So, but let's talk for a minute, about the first bullet in some ways. And this is something that I think is of interest. It probably is of interest to many of you right now, because you're signed up for this, this workshop, and yet it's not something that everybody's often comfortable with. And so let's talk a little bit more, about that. I want to talk about both instances in which you're crafting and thinking about your own voice and what's interesting about your work, and then instances when you're being asked questions about it. So let's move to the next slide here. I just want to offer an example. I think that it's really valuable, for you to always start, obviously, with the tenure granting research that we're all wanting to contribute to, but then it's also important, I think, to think about the translation of that. And so sometimes that can happen quite directly. So I talk about the example of a book that I worked on a couple of years ago called Misinformation in Mass Audiences. And the actual book itself has it's been picked up and used in a lot of graduate seminars, and that's interesting. There's an academic audience for it. But beyond that, there were additional opportunities. And so we worked, for example, with American Scientist magazine, to publish an excerpt from the book. And I think more people probably have read the excerpt, than have read the original book. Similarly, I then followed up with American Scientist. It was on their radar when the pandemic broke out, to write a blog post. And here's an opportunity you often have in 500 to 800 words to make sense of, to offer a perspective. There's room for some speculation. It should be grounded in your peer-reviewed ideas, but there's an opportunity for you to comment on what issues of the day might be. And that's something that we're socialized away from doing sometimes, and in terms of you think about the discussion section of your paper and taking that even a step further to potentially comment on areas that you haven't necessarily directly written a peer-reviewed research article on, but you've written work that's certainly quite relevant and that you can comment on theoretically. That can be helpful to kind of branch into that perspective. I know that you might worry about the time that takes away from your other research, but the reason I point out this example is that actually in my own particular situation, I've been very busy this year, not only with regards to public understanding of the pandemic, but also with regards to misinformation. Here in the United States, there are a lot of reasons why we've been particularly concerned with that in the political arena. But some of the invitations that I've gotten to talk with the National Academies of Sciences or the National Institutes of Health or other, I think at least some of those have come about because people have encountered popular press references. So it actually can be academically useful, to be out there in ways that other academics might recognize. And so that's something worth thinking about strategically, as well. But let's move to the next slide here, because I want to offer some more direct insight here. And then I want to hear from you all in terms of some of your experiences. Here, I'm going to put on the hat of public radio show host just for a minute. And this is we've hosted the Measure of Everyday Life for six years now. It's a weekly show, and so that's a lot of interviews and a lot of preparation for interviews and a lot of consternation and worry on the part of people that we sit down with. We're a little bit of a longer form show. We're half an hour, so it's more than the 5-minute, short story. It's not necessarily, an hour or 2 hours either, though. So that half an hour goes quickly, but we're usually focused on, 1 or 2 people at most in that 30 minutes. And so here's some ideas that I talk about in coaching people, and we usually spend some time preparing and talking with them beforehand. I'd like to say that the level of preparation that we offer with people is common. I don't think that that's true. We've gotten a fair amount of praise for sending the questions in advance, and that's not always what happens. So it's worthwhile to note that. But I just want to note that there is room for you, to really be your full self, in these types of interviews. I think it's important to think about, an interview like you would a dinner conversation with somebody that you're obviously know well enough to have dinner with, again, pre-pandemic, to think about people that you can talk with about your work, but that may not necessarily know everything about your work. And so that tone works pretty well. It's not necessarily the formal tone of an academic address always, but it's something a little bit more casual. That will go over well with audiences. It's important for you to talk as yourself and to talk as a human being and as a person doing this research. We often talk in third person distance in a way that I think is much less compelling, certainly, to talk with a journalist about this. So you can use your own voice. I also think it's important for you to recognize that very specific anecdotes and stories actually are quite compelling. So you might want to stay careful and talk in a generality and talk in an abstract way, and that's actually not very useful sometimes. I think back to an interview that we did, and we were talking with researchers who were talking about the work that they were doing to understand economic recovery and community resilience in the face of hurricanes. And and so one of the stories, and I still remember it now, they talked to us about was about doing some research in the wake of Hurricane Joaquin, which struck South Carolina a number of years ago. And the work, so here we're talking about economic, recovery and community resilience, but what was really compelling was the story that they told about setting up a mobile van and survey response sort of van in the parking lot of a grocery store in the South. There's a grocery store chain called the Piggly Wiggly. And so they're talking about setting up their van in the parking lot of this Piggly Wiggly and having people drop by and talk to them, about their stories. And that vivid story was actually the most interesting part of the interview. And so I want you to realize that sometimes the work that you do in a laboratory, sometimes the work that you do in Indonesia, sometimes the work that you do, out in the field somewhere, that itself is really compelling. And so part of the reason why we actually put the measure of everyday life together was my contention that the human beings doing research are often engaged in, frankly, sometimes heroic work to get these stories out, to get these voices out. And we're overlooking that. And so you ought to be able to celebrate and talk about just how hard it is to do the work that you're doing. We are very early on, we did an episode on human trafficking research. A really harrowing topic, and one that's really important to put a spotlight on. It's a really difficult, challenge for the world. Part of what's interesting about that work, though, is just even thinking about the ethical considerations, around interviewing participants. How it is that you actually logistically make that happen? How do you protect, them as you're interviewing and talking with them? That itself is interesting. That's not necessarily what is going to be the headline of a peer-reviewed journal article, but it might be partly what's interesting to somebody like me on this show, and to somebody else that you might build that in as you're talking with people about your work. And so I think it's also the case. You think about how discouraged a lot of us were with the earlier comments. Here's what people think about our work. They don't think it's interesting. They don't think it's applied. They don't think it's relevant. I want you to also realize, though, that there's an opportunity you have to invite curiosity about your topic. If you are able to be passionate and interested in it, that could be contagious. frankly. And so, imagine that you do work on, kelp, on aquaculture and kelp farming, kelp development. There's all kinds of angles to that, that you might get really interested in, and that you might be excited and enthusiastic about yourself. And it's okay for you to relay that. And so that's something, worthwhile to keep in mind. The last bit of advice, though, that I'll offer is one that I think it's important, to have some sense of self-awareness, particularly on a 30-minute interview that goes by quickly. One rule of thumb, that I often share with guests is, if you feel like you're rambling on and on, you probably are. It's probably worthwhile to recognize that. Now, you often will come across as much more calm and collected and interesting than you realize. So it's not worthwhile to monitor yourself in that regard, because we're usually terrible, critics of ourselves. But if it feels like you're stealing the stage, for too much time, that's worthwhile to kind of yield, make sure that others are invited, there. So similarly, here, I want to hear from you all. And so I've been talking for quite a bit of time. So if we want to move to the next slide, I do want to hear just what some of your, adventures have been, in terms of, talking with a journalist about your work, in terms of, sending out a press release that nobody picked up, and putting out a blog post. What have been, and here we can talk about horror stories, we can talk about great successes, but just a couple of anecdotes to kind of get the conversation moving, I think would be helpful for other people also, to have some sharing there. So actually, here what I'm going to do is, if you want to, Cheryl, to move off of the screen sharing just for a minute, so that we've got everybody on screen there. And I'm going to put my participant list up as well. So if people want to raise a hand, you can do that, or you can put something in the chat, which we can look at. But here, if people are willing to maybe voice some thoughts, and I see some cameras coming back on, which is good too. But what stories can people tell about instances when they've attempted to or been invited to be in the public spotlight with regards to their research? Any stories that we might be able to share here? What do you think? And some of you might be quite veteran at this and might have some lessons learned for the rest of us, and that would be great to hear about too. Elaine, great, thank you so much. What do you think?
So I was invited to do an interview with CBC Radio, and I've never done this. And so I thought we were just having a practice run. Yes. Okay. And it wasn't. And I said some pretty controversial things, including Canada has a social caste system. Gosh, I called out the university I'm at. And at the end I said, okay, so let's go. And it was too late. It was live.
Wow. Okay. Right. And so that was, now chances are that, you were speaking, truthfully in a way that probably was compelling. And so if you'd been overly prepared and rehearsed, there's trade-offs. Now, I'm sure that there was some, challenges that you faced maybe after. And so that there's that. Yeah.
There's some people in power very upset. Okay. But it was just based on my research. I know these are uncomfortable conversations, and I was pretty intense because I didn't know to tone it down.
Right. So, but this raises an interesting point, and one that, different campuses vary in terms of, policies and assistance for, this kind of thing. That said, there's an argument to be made that, speaking the truth and speaking in a way that's the only way you're going to break through and actually be part of some of these larger conversations. And so if you're too careful about everything, then you're just not going to get noticed. And for, that's something, it's important to keep that in mind. Knowing going into it, where you want to go and where not, it's worthwhile. And that dividing line between live versus taped is important. And it's unfortunate that they didn't give you a better preparation for that. In our show, for example, I'll often tell people, look, there's a bit of a safety net here because we're taping this. And if you go down a rabbit hole and you're criticizing McMaster and you don't want to do that, you can take a breath and start your answer over again. We're okay with that. And we will edit that out, and that's fine. other instances, when you're on live, and that's, it's worth knowing that. So, okay, how about some other thoughts on this? Other instances where it might have been, a local newspaper, or it might have been your own effort to, put out word about your work. Other stories you might be able to share here. What do you think? Look for some other hands, or I'm also in the chat, or also feel free to just to speak up. Hopefully, we won't have too much talking over each other. Yeah. Yeah, Suzanne.
Yeah, so I have a story of 2 reports. So I did a report that was kind of a volunteer project off the side of my desk. I wasn't planning to publish out of it for the LGBT community in Hamilton. And
Okay.
I didn't consider it very good research. It had really high community engagement, but because it was so community engaged, it meant that the questions didn't work that well in a survey, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it was so political, it took away from the science part of it. Anyways, so this report came out, and an incident happened at the local Pride in Hamilton. And then all of a sudden, all of these people are asking me to comment on what's going on in Hamilton and hate in Hamilton and whatnot about this report.
Yeah.
And I kind of shooed most of them away and tried to just talk to the report, because I felt like I can only talk to the data. Anyways, but then I have a 3-year project, much better funded, much better data, way better looking at LGBT communities and work, more related to my actual research in Sudbury and Windsor. And I mean, part of it is we launched the report during a pandemic, but that the report is like way better. And not very many people, like I got, media coverage in Sudbury and Windsor, but even in Sudbury and Windsor, they're like, why did you study our community? It's like there's such a sense of like our community is not important. They're like,
yes.
Why did you study us? And there was very little interest from the media. And anyways, but I think it had to do with that incident in the other case. Anyway, so that's, I think, other contextual things going on. And the other one was during COVID and whatnot. And like, but I don't know. So it's kind of,
what a rich set of examples, Suzanne, and it's really important. I think there's a couple things you touch on that I think are crucial, insights. So timing does matter a lot, unfortunately, and timing is not always under control. And so that's something that, as I mentioned before, some of the work that I do is that I not only have done work on public understanding of infectious disease, but also work on misinformation. So what a weird couple of years that it's been, for our group. But there's other work that I think is, on some level better or more rich or interesting, and I get that. And that it doesn't necessarily see. So part of it is to not take it personally, to not necessarily view it as an indication of, the rigor, to recognize that sometimes some work has a long shelf life. And you'd be surprised where, a couple years down the road, there might be an opportunity to put a spotlight back on this, this newer report, and that the timing might be better at a certain moment. It's an interesting question where you want to go and not go in terms of commenting on things. I've had probably the silliest thing that I ever had. I had a local TV reporter stop by. They know that I had been on and talked about a bunch of other things, and they knew that I taught a course on psychology of advertising. So I wasn't sure it was at the end of the day, and it was in February, and they wanted me to comment on the psychological value or perception of what people have of the color red. This is coming close to Valentine's Day, and this was not anything that so in that particular instance, it was a challenge to be diplomatic, but I'm trying to remember back, I offered something there, but there are dividing lines that I think are important to keep in mind in the work that I do on misinformation, for example. Generally speaking, I have been careful to not, I publish work on political perceptions, and as a social scientist, I do work somewhat in that arena, but generally there's a lot of opportunity to comment on the really outlandish political examples in the US, and I've tended to defer or refer people to other people that I know that can comment on those, and have tried to stay more in the health and science arena. But within that, And this is something you all might have differing viewpoints on, but Suzanne's example is crucial to keep in mind, because you might have an opportunity to comment on things that you don't necessarily feel like are either the best examples of your work or that are either fully representative of your work. And the question is, do you cede that ground to other pundits and other folks who are going to rush in and talk about it anyway? Or do you use that as an opportunity to try to at least advocate for or put a spotlight on some themes or ideas that you think are important? And so, that's a bit of an ethical trade-off, but I do think that there's more that you each probably can talk about than you probably give yourselves credit for. And that's something that is, you're probably going to have to think about this slightly expanded range, because that's some of the questions that you'll get are ones that are slightly outside of your carefully, caveated peer-reviewed article. And it's worthwhile to keep that in mind. Let me just see if maybe one other person, I saw some other thoughts here. Anybody else that has a story they want to relay? Yeah, Gregory.
So I'm currently involved in this. I'm not 100% sure how it'll turn out, but I have 2 reports that are going to be going out into the world next week. But I do, I'm a social sociologist, and I've had experience with research and with groups that are opposed to the mass incarceration and the high use of detention and immigration in the United States. And so when COVID came, I decided to do reports first and not do the academic research, partly because I knew people in that world. And so I I proposed actually to do these analyses to look at how many infections can be linked to prisons and to detention centers. Yeah. It's a kind of a human geography kind of methodology and epidemiology kind of quantitative research. And so I ended up, it was kind of interesting because I was working with collaborators and fellow travelers, if you will, who aren't social scientists. And when I would present these statistical results, it was kind of interesting because I was thinking about mental models. We really negotiated this report, and I ended up co-authoring it with a media, oftentimes a journalist. So both reports are now co-authored by somebody who's actually a journalist to get it out into the world. And so we had our first interview with an exclusive, a journalist wanted to have an exclusive and put it out into the world when it comes out next week on immigrant detention. But it was kind of interesting that I would have never, well, 2 things. One, I would have never come up with the package. And in fact, the interview yesterday, the reporter wanted to interview me, and I said, well, I want somebody, this is a Detention Watch Network. It's somebody working on immigration issues. I said, well, I want somebody from your shop there because I don't know the kind of details. And much of the conversation was between the Detention Watch, kind of the talking points there and things like that. And there was a couple of bullet points. I saw, when that bullet point slide came up, that's what this came down from. There's a couple of bullet points from this entire report is based on a social science foundation, but that's like an iceberg. And then there's a couple of points that pop up and I would comment on. In fact, once we get off here, the journalist sent me a paragraph on the data findings to find out, the data to find out. But it was kind of interesting. And I've been thinking, actually, that's not a bad, instead of doing the academic research first and then trying to find a group I already know to see if they're interested, this was, and again, it was about timing. I mean, with COVID, by the whole point of the policy conclusions of these things are let people out of prison and stop detaining immigrants to the United States. Yeah. If you care about the health effects of it. Right. And so by the time you went through peer review, whatever would have happened on that front would have already happened. So all of this was not well thought out. It was all very contextual and off the top of my head what to do. But in the longer term, I'm actually thinking this may not be a bad approach to actually collaborate from the outset instead of doing my research and trying to sell it later.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you raising that point, Gregory, because I mean, I think you can go too far down that road towards just chasing the latest buzzword. But I think paying attention, but your example is great. I mean, you're sort of grounded in what can I contribute based on my methods and expertise, to the emerging issues of the day. And so paying attention to what's out there, realizing that there's instances in which what on emerging issues, it could well be informed by a rigorous study. What can we do quickly to sort of engage, there? That's useful. Paying attention to, and so part of our job is to become better listeners, I think, to think about, and you can be cynical about this. I have colleagues that frankly I think are cynical about this, that publish almost exclusively on buzzwords in order to try to get the most citations, and that's a little bit frustrating. But I think but that's different than what you're saying, Gregory, of really kind of thinking about like what are issues that call for a sociological perspective, and that we could address. And the other part of this is to realize that it's a long game, and that patience is important. And what I mean by that is I've had conversations that I've done background interviews with journalists that have never seen the light of day in terms of my name appearing, but that have informed where they're going. And then eventually it's some referral or somewhere down the line, I do hear from somebody. And so I think being willing to entertain, not just turning away all invitations is useful, realizing that not all of them are going to go well, but that eventually it's useful. And then I've also seen a couple of great comments come in on the chat. So I want to just acknowledge those. One, and I'm just going to quickly try to summarize without all of the nuance that I know is in some of these chat comments. But one was with regards to social media and your own possibility for engagement with Twitter and things like that. And then also on blog posts as well. And it looks like there's a few other, you all helpfully commenting and talking with each other as well. I don't want you to walk away from here thinking, sometimes you'll hear folks say, gosh, you've got to be on Twitter, you've got to be doing, I'm not sure that that's true. I think that there are ways that you can productively engage with social media as a part of what you do, not the only thing you do. And in fact, just, there are dangers there too. I think that being on LinkedIn and being active in there is helpful. Being on Twitter and noticing and seeing when there are opportunities to connect with other, credible resources, that's helpful. It's you're not going to flip a switch and magically overnight that's going to get you, all these major media interviews. But sometimes it can be helpful to connect to other people and to just get. So it's just yet another thing to do to add. On social media, it's sometimes tough to verify where people are coming from. Some of the work that I do specifically on misinformation, it will occasionally rub people either the wrong way or attract unsavory attention. I got frustrated, this past year. I currently have a locked Twitter account, so it's open and transparent, but yet I'm just being a little bit careful. I got threatening direct messages and some other things that I didn't necessarily want to deal with. So it's just worthwhile to be careful as you're kind of wading through, that territory, but still helpful, I think, to be out there. Blog posts that don't seem to attract much attention, I want to encourage people to stay with it, because sometimes what you need to do is actually put something out there in a nice, coherent, searchable way that you can link to, and that it might take a while. The way I tend to think about this is building a campfire. And sometimes you need kindling, and it just takes a while for things to kind of take off. And if you've got something that's out there as a great blog post that's representative of your perspective that you have in your email signature, or that you send to somebody as an example of what you're thinking about, it's going to be a great calling card and a great heuristic that is crucial. That it might be 6 months after you originally wrote it that it's actually useful, but it's still currency for you to share. Here's a shorthand way of what I think about this essay that I wrote. And it can be really helpful in that regard. So I would encourage you all to think about all of that. And then I've got a couple of other comments and questions, and I will respond to those here in just a moment as well. But just keeping an eye on our time, let's move back out to the slides, and I want to offer just an additional vantage point on what you might do to kind of address some of the rampant misinformation that we're seeing. Okay, and okay, so if we want to move to the next slide. and move to the next slide beyond that, I want to offer just a few thoughts on misinformation as something that might be a pet peeve of yours. You might be worried or concerned as you've heard this. And I want to offer a vantage point. And this really, the reason I thought I'd raise this is because my take on this has a lot to do with empathy for audiences. And that's something that, and it also has to do with a comment on the nature of our media systems and our public information environment that I think is helpful for us to keep in mind. So an example that I often talk about, these days when I talk about misinformation, is a story that I first encountered in Australia. A few years ago, I was invited to give a keynote address for a conference there. And it turns out I learned the story of a woman by the name of Belle Gibson. Now, you go ahead and go to that, Cheryl, the next slide. So Belle Gibson is a fascinating figure. She is somebody who rose to fame, speaking of social media, on social media as this advocate for a particular nutritional means of in her words, curing cancer. She touted her own experience, with this approach, and had a lot of social media following, had attracted a lot of attention. There's a problem, though, in that her story turned out to not be true. She actually never had cancer, and the whole thing was a fraud. And so there's a lot that we might worry about there in terms of ethics, right? And so there's a lot of comment that you might make with regards to Belle Gibson. But the comment that I think we ought to consider, or the consideration we ought to have, is the role that we all play in this. How is it that she actually rose to such fame, to begin with? So if you want to move to the next slide. I think that actually we tend to overlook our own vulnerability to misinformation. And I think that we are interested in certain types of stories. We are interested in sharing those stories, and that leaves us all vulnerable. And by pointing out that we're all vulnerable to sharing sensational stories sometimes, that leaves us to be in a better spot in terms of empathy. And empathy, I think, is really the pathway forward here as a remedy to actually addressing the sharing of misinformation. I think if you want to build up trusted relationships between institutions and audiences, you first have to not shame them and to recognize that it was legitimate, the reason, the interest people might have in particular stories, if you're going to then redirect them to credible information. So if you want to move onto the advance to the next part of the slide, I just want to point out two observations about humanity that I think are probably quite keenly apparent during this pandemic, but that hopefully are not controversial. The first is that we all need social connection. We're all suffering from not having it during this pandemic. It's something that we as social beings need to have. We also need to have hope for the future. We struggle when we don't have that. So what I just want to point out is that we like to have reasons to talk to each other, and we need to have hope. And when we don't have either of those, if certain pieces of misinformation actually offer some kind of remedy or salve for that, we're going to see it flourish like wildfire. So, those stories that proliferate in terms of, false information, it's not that they're false, it's that they're often have been framed in ways to be sensational and to offer some glimmer of hope when the carefully caveated, scientific report doesn't. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind. And it's also the case that people are not necessarily interested in just sharing truth with one another. They're not necessarily interested in just sharing factual observations. Sometimes they're just interested in connecting with one another, and they're connecting in terms of tribal identity or connecting in terms of a sense of shared community. And there's no better example of this than back in the pre-pandemic days when you'd be in an elevator with somebody that you both have just come in from outside, and you talk to them about the weather. You both have been outside. You're not sharing new information, but you're talking to them because you're trying to signal, I see you, you're part of my community. I think the same thing happens on social media quite often. We get really worried about people sharing all kinds of blatantly false information. I think partly what they're trying to do is just connect with each other to show that they're on the same team. And I think doesn't make it right necessarily, but it makes it more understandable. I think we've got to keep that in mind. because that should really be at the heart of our approach to trying to take steps forward, to be not necessarily the shaming person out there on social media saying, this is wrong, you're all wrong, but rather trying to figure out what values people have and then to address those values with our research. And so if you want to move to the next slide here, generally out of this, all the work we've done and the perspective we have, I just like to emphasize that we're all vulnerable to misinformation, that I think actually empathy and compassion are going to be the key to our future interventions. So if you want to move to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick sense of some of the public facing intervention that we've done. Recently, not recently now, a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to work with Excite, which is the European Association of Science Museum Professionals. They were quite interested in having me come over and develop a workshop that was going to be framed in terms of quote unquote combating misinformation. They were ready to go toe to toe with all of these purveyors of false information that are out there. I thought that was the wrong frame, and as you'll see here reflected in the actual title of the workshop, I think it's important that we move beyond a sense of needing to fact check everything and instead towards recognizing that, science museums, as an example, are potentially important community hubs. They're places of dialogue and community building. That's really where we ought to focus on bringing people in, inviting them to, our credible information rather than necessarily correcting all the ways that they're wrong. That's also been important in terms of a healthcare professional intervention that I've developed with colleagues. And so if you want to move to the next slide, there. And this is something that I've done with colleagues at Duke University. We've developed a workshop for clinicians on what to do when patients show up in the examination room, or now increasingly on Zoom, with outlandish misinformation that they've found on the internet. What do you do about that? How do you have those conversations? That's something that we're really excited. This seems to be a needed, training and something that people are really gravitating to it. So it's been gratifying to work on that, but it's rooted in empathy and compassion. Okay, so if you want to move to the next slide. If anybody's interested in more information about that, there's a website on the Duke Center for Healthcare Safety and Quality. You can look that up later. I'd be happy to partner and talk with folks in Canada about that. But more importantly, given the time that we have here, let me move to the next slide. And I want to invite you to think about this for next time. And here's what I want to do, next time, if you all are open to this, is to have you, talk about your own research, how it's relevant to something that's in the headlines, today, how your research can help, how it's relevant, and for you to talk about that in 2 minutes or less. And it's a huge challenge. And that's why I'm not going to put you on the spot to do it today. But I want you to think about this during the week. And we've got time next time. I actually want to hear from, everybody. We will, depending on where our registration numbers are and the timing that we have, we might do that first in breakout groups and then all together, or just do it all together. And I want to offer some real-time feedback and to have others do that as well. And frankly, it might be an advertisement to the other people on the phone and to Cheryl and Allison about what you're all about. And so that might be an opportunity to give a little bit of an advertisement to your work as well. It may not go well, may not be happy with your 1 or 2 minute version of it, but at least it's a step towards that, that direction. Some of you that have had the media engagement that we've just talked about are used to this, but for others, this might be the first time that you've tried to conceptualize it that way. And what I want you to do here is to not be afraid to have the way that you frame this be slightly different than you've thought about it before, because it might be that you're contributing to lots of conversations, or potentially able to, in ways you hadn't thought about. So I want you to think about this in terms of the mental models of the people that we kept in mind, to begin this conversation. I want you to think about, those journalists in the second part of the conversation. If you had a minute, if you had a YouTube video, if you had a way to have a spotlight, for 2 minutes, like what would you say, about what you're working on right now, or what you'd like to be working on, as we had pointed out in Gregory's case, what do you think, you might be able to contribute? So we'll come back together next time and in a bit more of an open-ended way, offer some comment on that. I think it's be a nice sort of follow-up. I think sometimes with workshops like this, somebody comes in, just has some advice, and then they leave. And I want to just not have done that. So that was the thought that in talking with Allison about this, that I could come back and talk with you all if you've had a little bit of time to ruminate on this, and maybe that opens the door for more conversation. I know in the chat, there's been a few other comments as well. That's something that I might be able to also, address next time as well. I'm just looking there. But let's go back actually out now. You can move to the next slide, Cheryl, just for a second. A couple of email addresses for me there, if it's helpful to follow up, or you can find me on LinkedIn. That might be a good place to do that. But let's actually, Cheryl, come back out to the full group, because we've got just about 8-9 minutes left. And you might have had burning questions that you wanted to get answered in a session like this that might have been sparked. So maybe I could address a couple of those, or you have further comments that we weren't able to get to earlier, or Allison or Cheryl might have some thoughts as well. But yeah, what questions might you have? I know that's a lot to pack into 90 minutes. And so hopefully you found some pieces there to hold on to and to think more about later. But, and I've really appreciated the examples that you've raised so far. Any other questions or comments or thoughts? Maybe if you want to elaborate on something you put in the chat, I'm happy to talk about it out loud now here too. Whatever you think. Feel free to either raise a hand or show a hand on the screen, or to put something else in the chat. And I'll look at the chat now too. Okay, great. Allison, yeah.
Just a quick comment. One of the things that really struck me in the early conversations that I had with you was the importance of researchers really engaging with and paying attention to the other information diets that people have,
Yeah.
And being able to do a lot of both the understanding and the trust work before you try to actually communicate your work. So I was hoping you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, happy to. And so that's another reason to be, on Twitter. You might, like me, feel like it's hard to say, much in a few characters there, but you can get a sense of, partly what's out there. But that said, it's also a reason to be cautious, because Twitter does not represent public opinion. Many of my sociology friends will tell you that, Pew Research Center folks and others. And so it can also be helpful to have ways to have eyes and ears to community conversations, to be part of, go to town hall meetings, go to other, where you're listening just as a person who cares about what they're talking about, and to then keep that in mind. It might be that you're working on a very specific area of research and you are troubled by the fact that you don't often hear that in public discourse and public dialogue. And it's understandable. But you could reframe that opportunity, as Allison's saying here, and to think about, well, what could I contribute? What is it? And let me not misinterpret this lack of attention. I never hear this key phrase that I work on. I never hear this in a town hall meeting. I never hear this. Well, instead of feeling that people are turning their back on you or not reading your blog post, instead realize, well, people just might not have had an opportunity to hear about that or to understand what the heck it is you're talking about. So is there a way that you could contribute that perspective, to this dialogue or to this conversation? I find that it's really helpful. It can be helpful to hear and to listen to local TV news or other, just to hear the ways that people talk about, things. And what is it that you might contribute? It's often a very frustrating endeavor, and I acknowledge that. But it also makes sense to pay attention to like where people are attending to information. I had that opportunity, about 15 years ago now. The National Science Foundation funded me. I used to teach much closer to your neck of the woods. I used to teach in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and at the University of Minnesota. And when I was there, we worked on a National Science Foundation project that was focused directly on improving science coverage in local television news programming. And a lot of people that at that time, I remember having some conversations where people thought, what the heck are you doing? Local TV news is like the worst. This is not where you're going to hear any kind of, carefully nuanced discussion of anything. But when you ask people back at that point in time, that if anywhere, that's where they were hearing about, science news. And so that's where people were. And so it made sense. So let's try to do what we can, and to provide and supplement and subsidize the work of journalists. And so that project, the Discoveries and Breakthroughs in Science project, was an interesting one that I think actually was able to raise the bar there a little bit. And so, Allison, to your point, I just think, it's worthwhile. Some of you might just have a sense of guilty pleasure in terms of indulging in popular culture anyway. But here's a way to, sort of assume that you're doing that for your job, as well. And some of you might study that, too. But I think it's worthwhile to listen to the cadence and the agenda that's being raised there, because that you might be able to, to Gregory's point, even, or others, think about how you might contribute your next research project, or a graduate student, you might say, hey, look, you ought to find something out. Let's do some work on this. And that can be a great source of ideas. So I love that you raised that, Allison. Okay, let's see here. Are there other comments or questions that people have? I know we have just a minute or two. Maybe it's time for one more. Elaine, we'll give you maybe last word. Yep.
Okay, quickly. So I'm being interviewed next week. Okay. In the area where I currently live, and it's about community, and you're making me think that how I can frame this conversation we'll have is how can a regional university actually be contributing to its community, looking at my research maybe?
Yes, and here's
I mean,
something.
this is a big problem, but maybe.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And also, Elaine, you're going to be talking with the journalists, right? But recognize that you've got all those other people listening in. So like sometimes it's important to be responsive to the journalists, and I don't want to sound too much like a politician here, but like there's certain things you might want people to have heard. And so if this is a platform for you to so think more in terms of like what you'd love for the person on the street to hear. And find an excuse because actually it may be a back and forth where all of it is recorded, but it might be that just a couple of sound bites. And if your sound bites are filled with things that you'd like people to hear, and some of those get used, then it doesn't matter if you were like perfectly responsive to the question, And so, like, what are the themes you want to advocate for? And you want people to hear your work matters to people in the community. Even you just so happen to say, here at McMaster, we really care about doing work that, that benefits our local neighbors. What a great thing it's innocuous. You kind of get that into what your other larger answer is. And then you've said something that actually both maybe it'll get you back in better stead with folks at McMaster, but also will, it just might be nice to have that in there. So just, are there some things like that you can have that you could sort of package with the way that you say it, or is it an excuse to sort of raise that? Does that make sense? I think that could be good.
Yes, and so because I'm thinking, how can I make this a problem? And it is a problem, but it's not seen as a problem. But it is a problem for the community. And so it's a little dig at a local university to think about what is a regional university's responsibility.
Yes, no, I think that's exactly right. So that's great. Well, these are great. Yep, great comments. I know we're just about at the top of the hour, so I want to make sure that Allison and Cheryl, you might have administrative things with this series that you need to get back to. But thank you all. I really like having conversations like this. It's a nice break in my otherwise really crazy day. So so thanks very much. Yeah, Allison or Cheryl, any final words?
Thank you so much, Brian. As I'm sure many of you know, next Thursday, again, 9:30 to 11. Brian will be back, and
actually, I think we'll go 9:30 to 10:30, just as a preview on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And again, the focus will really be on what you have done in this homework assignment that Brian has given you about really framing your work for audiences. All right. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thanks very much.